now, and then I'm going to let everybody in.
All right, just give me 20 seconds.
You're good.
All right. Okay.
Welcome, everybody. Letting others gather in the room. We'll get going here in a minute. All right. Well, I've seen the number of people joining the Zoom room is declining and how fast it keeps growing up. So I'm going to get us all started here. Welcome, everyone, to the CCA Workshop on a nice Wednesday, March 12th. It's wonderful to have you all joining us. We are in great luck here. We've got Tom Borrup and Andrew Zitcer joining us today. Tom's beaming in from Bangkok. Andrew is coming in from someplace much less exotic. And they're going to be talking with us today about their new book on democracy as creative practice, Weaving a Culture of Civic Life. I know this is a topic that is on at least in my mind, is near the front of it of recent times. And I think we're gonna have a great conversation today. And as usual, I'm not going to go into the great detail to introduce that Tom works with creative community builders in Minneapolis, and Andrew's another faculty member out there and do important, great things. I'll let them do it, or I'll let you Google it in the background as we listen to their great talk, and we won't belabor the introductions any longer. Let's get right to letting them talk. So please take it away, gentlemen.
Okay, I'll get started. And Andrew and I are going to tag team here, which we've done this a couple times. I hope we don't blow it this time. But and if I'm incoherent, my excuse is it's 11 p.m. in Thailand, so I'm a little bit more weary than I might be in the middle of the day. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ideas behind the book. And then Andrew's going to kick in with talking about what's in the book. And I happen to see that Bronwyn, one of our authors, is in the group tonight, or tonight, whatever time it is. And we really want to get to Q&A too. And that's part of what we're going to talk about is how difficult it is to talk about democracy and as opposed to doing it, which we really would rather be doing. So next slide, Andrew. Andrew's controlling the slides. And the couple of big questions that came up for us in thinking about doing this book, and one of which is how and where do we learn and practice democracy? Next slide. Going into having a little class in high school about civics, it really doesn't do it. So, and the other question we had is, can the arts and culture sector turn its gaze, policies, and activities from contributing to the economy to contributing to democracy? Not that the work that the sector has been doing in creating jobs, in revitalizing communities economically and so on is a bad thing, but how can we also think about the sector contributing to democracy? I heard a speaker recently talk about working in cities, and he says we often hear about how do we create an environment in our city that's good for business. And he said, what about creating an environment that's good for democracy? So how do we do that? That's some of the questions that we wrestled with. And um, of course, there's a lot of forces. I'm not going to talk about threats to democracy particularly because we all know them, but um, the sector, and I've been part of this for many years, maybe unwittingly to some degree, but buying into kind of a neoliberal agenda of everything's about economics. Um, has kind of indirectly contributed to some deterioration in democracy in the world. So we need to really wrestle with that and try to turn that around. Next slide. This is probably not a place where you're learning democracy, the kind of environment or space um, that helps to learn about the principles and practices and really embodying democracy. And this is what a lot of our universities and classrooms and so on kind of look like. Not exactly, but I think you get the point. Next slide. So this is the other place where we think we learn about democracy, and it's really important. But it's not how we do it every day. This is something we might do every couple of years. And we really need to be thinking about democracy on a daily basis as a practice. Next slide. These are some of the this is just from some of my consulting work over the years, but just some of the spaces, the types of activities where you might actually be be learning and facilitating and helping practice democratic behaviors and working together with other people in these kinds of environments. Next slide. Um, so some of the terminology and ideas I'll just go over. There's one, and this is bigger in European countries, the democratization of culture, and this was kind of big after World War II, kind of this progressive idea of how do we help all those poor folks who don't have access learn about the great works of art of the world. That's wonderful and all, but it really is kind of a practice of colonization, cultural colonization. And I think a lot of the folks in the European community have kind of realized that and came to that. And now they're trying to turn this idea of democratization of culture around to become more about the practice, the processes of funding and curatorial decision making and so on being democratized. And that's some good work. Next slide. The other really important idea that I'm sure we've all been a part, I hope we've all been part of, cultural democracy. This is a more recent kind of value system, recognizing and supporting diverse cultures equitably, um, and bringing them into the public sphere. Next slide. And another common idea, it's not really new, but it's kind of been rebranded and now taught in a lot of art schools, social practice art. Um, And it's often about an artist or group of artists taking on a social issue of some sort and working on that issue. And that's all really great work. And it adds up, we hope, next slide, to process of another idea of co-creation. I kind of learned this from both artists and from some web-based activities and some of my practice in community and cultural planning about co-create. I'd left, there's no image here because we all have to imagine together what the image might be. Next slide. And we came around to this idea of a culture of democracy. And not the first people to use that term, but really thinking that this is something we really have to be part of a daily culture that we in the environment we learn and function and live within is one of a democracy. And we build on these other practices that I just talked about in constructive ways to see this as part of everyday life and how we practice, how we do our business, how we teach and learn, how we relate to our neighbors, and et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. Um, so going back to John Dewey, relying on a lot of his work and others, but just pulling one quote from him, only as we realize in thought and act that democracy is a personal way of individual life that it signifies the possession and continual use of certain attitudes, forming personal character and determining desire and purpose in all the relations of life. So that's kind of idea we're coming back around to that we hope to express in this work. Next slide. So, why artists? Um, we chose this image. It's kind of the sort of nanobots kind of operating on the culture. And that's kind of one of the ways that I see artists as tinkering away at changing and building, sometimes reinforcing some cultural ideas and behaviors and attitudes and think ways of thinking. And that's kind of what artists do. Next slide. And in contemporary times, and some of us have been part of the kind of work that how artists do their work and convene and bring people together and build a process of making art. And that's one of the things uh, that we'd love to see happening more and more. Next slide. So, just to say, artists alone can't save democracies, but and this is kind of maybe speaking to the chorus here this afternoon, but we want to tell other people that artists are really needed on the team, and they can provide everyday transformative experiences of democracy, and that symbolize, demonstrate, help us practice on a everyday kind of level. And we hope then that translates to broader social scales. Um, and we love the work that artists do. And communities. So I think this is about where Andrew's going to take over. These are a few images from the book, actually, of some of the artists um, doing some of the work.
All right, so I'm gonna unmute and I'm gonna jump in and I'm just gonna say hi everyone. I'm Andrew Zitcer and I'm calling from Philadelphia, which Doug sort of noted was a less exotic location than Tom is in, but I'm not sure that's really true. Having spent a lot of time in this city, and so we really arrived at some of these observations in collaboration with the 36 authors that participated in this edited volume. They represented 7 different countries. We had some people that we knew we wanted to engage, and then we also put an open call out through various networks and had more than 50 submissions of really exciting projects. So we know this work is widespread and thoughtful and diverse. So we tried to capture the essence of those range of practices in 4 buckets. The first that we looked at was place-based actions, which are grounded in community, grounded at the local scale, and really thinking about how to transform place collectively with cultural intervention in the kind of local democracy space. And then the second one was really about aesthetic strategies. So what does it look like to have a process and a product that's aesthetically rich but rigorous from the scale of participatory structure and engaging questions of democracy? The third one was about learning environments. If we call back to Dewey or to Bell Hooks or any of the other thinkers on these topics, learning and education is a critical dimension of building a culture of democracy. And of course, I think one of the things that's going on now is that people have been so deprived of a civic education that, when you have adults who don't know that the government takes in tax revenue rather than pays tax revenue, or that the weather is not controlled by the Democrats, for instance. Certain kinds of core structural questions that arise when people don't have access to information that helps them make decisions about their own agency vis-a-vis democracy. Then the last one is about civic processes, thinking about things like artist in residence in government, or we have Bronwyn on the call, and Bronwyn wrote about Artists for Democracy, really engaging people in questions about voting and participation in the political process. And so these were just 4 buckets that speak to the broader range, and it was just an organizing strategy for us to try to make sense of the rich variety of practices that are out in the world. And in terms of the way democracy intersects with these artist practices, there are at least 6 ways in which those things happen. One is the very important work of storytelling, restorying, and construction of narratives so that everyone has a sense of voice, power, and agency. The second is the way we design our built environment. Obviously, we talk about histories in the states of redlining and urban renewal, root shock, the destruction of communities, and the way we are trying to revisit questions. As an urban planner, I can say we're constantly thinking about ways to restore and repair harm that our field has done to communities. And I think artists are a critical part of that. The next thing is this issue of the level of power and hierarchy in organizations, in cultural spaces, in civic spaces, and revisiting those questions and highlighting them. And that leads to the question of civil discourse and deliberation. How do we actually talk across differences, which is increasingly challenging work? And that encourages us to think about organizing and advocacy. And so we have artists doing things like organizing people to rethink a transit intersection that's deadly, or advocating around a housing crisis. So there's a number of ways in which that work plays out. And then also this notion that, even though voting is only one way of doing democracy, it is an essential ingredient in doing democracy. So how do we engage people both in voting and also in governing? And we've seen artists in residence in government and other spaces that have helped to enrich the conversation. So I'm going to just quickly highlight 3 examples from the book, but I really encourage you to spend time with the chapters, and there's a link at the end for you to take a look at the book. I won't be able to do justice to the richness of these stories, but just to name a few examples of what we're looking at. Here in Philadelphia, there's a group led by Lisa Jo Epstein called Just Act, and the story that she tells in the book is about a community center in North Philadelphia that was both a senior center, like a day center for seniors, and a rec center for active recreation. And the city was undertaking a process to renovate that space. And so Lisa Jo worked with non-actors, non-professional actors who were actually just the civic core of people who were involved in that conversation about redeveloping that site, and engaged them in theater strategies that were taken from the work of Augusto Boal and John O'Neill, and this whole notion of like restoring what this space wanted to be through dramatic action and engaging people who had never thought of themselves as performers in performing a future for this space that they arrived at collectively through story circles and what she calls gift backs and a number of other incredible facilitation techniques to empower neighbors, sort of often consulted by the city, but in a very tokenistic, transactional way to actually have it be really generative. Another one is LA Commons and Karen Mack's work to think about an interdisciplinary cross-sector collaboration, particularly with communities of faith, to really think about visioning and thinking about the city's future. Karen is on the City Planning Commission, and she's an artist and an arts organizer. And so what does it mean for coalitions to come together and think about how to create a more inclusive and just city? And it happens that we're doing an event at the end of March with Karen in LA. And of course, we all know that LA has been devastated by wildfires. And one of the other chapters in the book is written by Anna Kennedy Borissow in Melbourne. And she had worked on creative recovery with folks who were affected by wildfires there over a decade ago. And she's going to come to LA, be with Karen, and engage with the LA community around how they can frame their ideas of creative recovery. So the book is kind of a catalyst for connections among the authors and across place in ways that I think are very rich. The last example we'll share with you today is just the story from Tom's hometown, or his residence in Minneapolis, of the work that Lake Street Arts and Pangea World Theater are doing in the wake of George Floyd's murder to envision what that corridor wants to be. And the way they were able to kick off that visioning conversation was through the creation of a work of public art with Angela Tusars, who's an Indigenous artist who created this incredible cocoon structure that thousands of people participated in, giving their feedback and their inputs about their thoughts about the experience of grief and loss and hope in that place, and then turning that into a cocoon that eventually became this incredible butterfly mural. So, there's a million different ways this stuff happens. So when we think about this, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and my job here is to pose the problems, and Andrew talks about the solutions. So these next 2 slides just kind of like one of the things that we've been encountering with this talking about the book and being invited to various places to talk about it is, being put on a podium in a traditional auditorium to talk about democracy just kind of feels like this is really not democracy. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we do, and we want to engage you all in some conversation after we're done like blabbering at you about some of your thoughts and experiences and how you go about doing work that may promote democracy in your classrooms or through your research projects or whatever it may be. But the kind of idea of do as I say, not as I do, and I often think in my teaching work, it's how I teach that they learn more from sometimes than what I'm trying to tell them. Um, and so trying to be very conscious of that. Next slide. So, this idea, students as empty vessels, knowledge bestowed by authorities, they're the recipients and rarely active agents in their learning. And that's unfortunately the traditional model of education and learning practices. And many of us, try to mess with that. And so that's part of what we want to talk about um, today. So next slide, and I think then Andrew takes it away again.
Yeah, sounds good. I think one of the things that Tom has brought up is that the spatial container in which we learn and in which we think about and deliberate about democracy is vastly and hugely important to the outcomes that are available. And so Tom and I have been really lucky to present this work in many different cities and contexts. And the first question we've always asked on this sort of book tour is like, what's the space? Can we move the chairs? Can we have movement? Can we have noise? Can we have song? Because that kind of sets the tone for the kind of learning and connection that can happen there. And so we've been able to involve artists in pretty much every one of these events. In New York at CUNY, we had a music piece where people did like a meditation and facilitated exercise to a piece of specially recorded music. Here in this talk in Nashville, Sona Kuftanix was helping us do movement in sort of like Brownian motion, incredible use of the space facilitated exercises that led to us on the right-hand side, the creation of a tree together, which sort of arose out of the conversations. And in other events, we've done a variety of different interventions, but by doing this first and then talking about what democracy is, we get very different answers than we get if you just sit people in a seminar room or even in rows and say, what do you think of democracy? It actually just opens up space for contemplation and deliberation and connection among strangers. So these are people who don't come in always into the room knowing each other, but by the end, there's a sense of fellowship that comes from embodiment and making something creative together. So one of the things that Tom and I have been thinking about is, well, we're out here on the road sort of doing this as a spectacle, kind of a book event, a one-off. But how does this actually affect our strategies of teaching and research in the ways that will empower both us and our students and community partners to be doing democracy whenever we're learning together? So this kind of respatialization and moving things around has led to a number of different, forms. So in Osuna, Spain, at the SCP&A conference, we had people having toasts and drinking and eating, and then playing a card game and doing improv games, and just a kind of way to not even within one session have multi-modes of engagement, and all kinds of interactivity. In Philly, we had a dance artist do a celebration for us at the end of an event. We've also put things up on the walls. I mean, we're just messing with space, and we're co-creating and constantly thinking about the process as informing the product. So in terms of the teaching, and this is where I think we're going to start to open it up to your thoughts. I've been teaching a class for 10 years called Civic Engagement and Participatory Methods. It's a required course at Drexel in my urban studies program that I run. And the course is half Drexel students and half community residents who sort of self-nominate to take the course because of work they're doing as library captains or block captains or ward leaders or, on a business improvement district. And for the whole academic quarter, these two cohorts come to class together and they learn basically community organizing skills, how to facilitate a meeting, how to pitch media on a story about your community. And that has been a very successful course over the last 10 years. But there was one part of it that was really not working. And that part was where we were sort of talking about the readings. And the faculty in the audience will know sometimes that works really well and sometimes it's totally deadly. And in this setting, talking about the readings for 45 minutes at the end of class was the least exciting part. But the talking was good and the ideas were good, but the texts that we were using, even though they were really inspiring texts, just weren't giving enough space for students to sort of build that relationship with each other. And so this year, with the support of a fellowship through Drexel called the Unmapping Fellowship, which is funded by Mellon, my co-instructor and I were given space to think about how to incorporate creative writing into this class. So in the end, we've swapped out the time where we talk about the readings, and we bought students a poetry anthology and a very fancy notebook. And every week in class, there are poems selected for them from that anthology that are tuned into the theme of the week's class. And there are writing prompts that generate ideas for them to share based on those themes and those poems. And we invite the students to write for 10 minutes. And we invite them then to share with a partner, not necessarily what they've written, because this is not a poetry class. This is an urban studies class. What did they feel when they were writing? What did they notice? What's a line, a word, a phrase that they want to share with their partner to just have a conversation about what's occurring for them? And what we have found we're in week 10 is next week, is that this creative activity has changed the entire course. And folks are willing to read their whole poems, stand up in front of the class and read them. They're volunteering to do it. Not everyone, but the idea is just that, this is a permission, not a requirement. And we've changed, with input from the students, our final assignment for the course from being a presentation to a group poetry reading and a zine that the students volunteered. 5 students in the class, community and Drexel students, are coming together to plan the making of this zine. So on Monday, the poems and art and other things people wanted to do, those were due. The students collected them. They're having it printed. And on the last night of class, which is this coming Monday, we're going to bind the books and make the zines together in class and have a reading and some food. And the thing that is all of this is kind of amazing to me as someone who's been teaching this class for 10 years. But the thing that I love the best is that I asked the zine working group to talk about what the students needed to do to submit their work and prepare. And they said, well, you're going to have 2 pages where you can put anything you want. But we also left a number of blank pages in the zine because you might not be comfortable sharing what you wrote with everyone. But you might want to write something just for yourself in the zine, something new. And I just thought that was an incredible innovation. It's not something I had thought about. And as we were moving through the class and I'm checking with students about what their favorite aspects of the class are, they're talking about the creative writing as the thing that is helping them see the course content most clearly and helping them build relationships with each other. And it's interesting. Of course, it's not all rah, rah, rah. I said to them, what's really hard about this? Of course, this is not a writing class. It was not marketed as a writing class. And many of you have never done this before. So be honest. And one Drexel student said, it's really hard for me because I want to start this writing exercise and get somewhere. I want a product, a finished product. And I find that by the end of the 10 minutes, my thoughts are just jumbled and they're all over the place. So I feel a sense of perfectionism about it. And one of the community students said, I really hear what you're saying, but I think of it like a dream. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of a dream and it's not finished, but I know I'm on to something. And then the next time I have a dream, maybe that's the continuation. So when I write for this class, I'm thinking it's just like a dream log. It's whatever comes and there's no perfection. And the student from Drexel said, oh my God, that really helps me not feel so perfectionist about it. And there's just this sharing and connecting that the creativity allows, which is the whole idea of the course, this community university liaison, but it's happening in different ways when creativity is at the front. So I'm very excited about the potential for this kind of teaching, this kind of engagement, this kind of problem solving to inform the way we generate, new forms of democratic practice, a new culture of democracy. So that's kind of in short, what we've been thinking about. Many more things to say, many more things to explore, but we want to do it in conversation with you. So with that, I'll pause and Doug, maybe you can lead us through some questions.
It's great. Excuse me. Wonderful, Tom and Andrew. Thank you so much for all of that. I love it. And normally I ask some, probing questions and we see where this goes. But I think you made the really good point. I think it was Tom. This is the Q&As can be the best part. And the worst thing I could do is get in the way of that. So I could keep it. I want to keep it super brief. I want to see some hands go up or see some comments and questions in the chats, please. Other people step in here and do this. And until then, I'll just make my one comment off the top, where I think Tom also mentioned early on that there's an interest in turning our gaze away, perhaps from being so focused on the economic impact of the arts to something else. And as an economist, I applaud that. I think that's great. I do think of the whole world through an economics lens, and I see that way. But that's just me and my own sort of personal handicap. But I'm really glad to see that we want to move the conversation and move our gaze in this direction. So I love it. My question, I guess, is not seeing any of the other hands pop up. I'd like you to comment a little bit more about how you define democracy. There are different definitions of it. I've got a sense from this that it's less about sort of a political system and counting votes, and that it's more about individuals having sort of equal standing and equal stake in crafting something. But I want to hear your words, please.
Well, as you said, Doug, there's a lot of definitions of democracy, and there's volumes and volumes written on it, of course. And we really see it as an everyday practice. It is a political system or systems. There's all kinds of democracies around the world. Some of them are, a little more real than others. The where I am right now in Thailand, that they have voting every once in a while, and they vote in a parliament, and somebody comes out on top is supposed to be the prime minister, but the military appoints what's the equivalent of the Senate, and they can overrule everything. So if they don't like who was elected prime minister, which happened just a couple of years ago, they decide that person's not going to be the prime minister. And if they feel they wanted to throw out the Constitution, the military and the king throw out the Constitution. Well, I just one little story. I went to the movies here a few days ago, and at the beginning of the film, they ask everyone to stand up to honor the king, and then they play this video like showing the king doing all these wonderful things, like providing health care and they're pretty good health care here, providing education, feeding the hungry, taking care of the indigent people, disabled, like this wonderful king. He's not necessarily that great as a person, I understand, but that's how they honor their leader. And so it's a little different than our country, where we watch our leaders like do one mean thing after another mean thing to people after. It's like, anyway, all kinds of democracies. So anyway, off point, but this everyday democracy, in how we go about our lives, how we dialogue and have discourse, how we teach, all these things we've been talking about. I mean, it's kind of a complicated definition, but it's all of those things. Andrew, you have
Yeah,
more
I'll just
intelligent
add to what
things.
Tom said. I mean, when we were in Toronto talking to folks, we had Andrea Asaf, who's a theater maker there, and Andrea was saying democracy is not the same thing as justice. And that really was important for me to hear, and to remember that where we are in the United States right now was arrived at through a democratic process. Where Hungary is today was arrived at least initially, through a democratic process. And so, as Tom highlights, like we can usher in non-just regimes through democratic practices. And of course, we know from the history of this country that our democracy was built on some incredibly lofty ideals at the expense of the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Black people and many other kinds of subjugation. So what we nominally term democracy as a kind of abstraction and an assumption has not been the case for so many people throughout our history and histories around the world. So just because we do things in a way that we call democratic, that doesn't mean that they're just, and that doesn't mean that democracy is enough. That we actually have to make these structures collectively at multiple scales in order to hold folks accountable to each other and to, and to justice.
I think justice and accountability are nice words to be keeping in the conversation. So much of what I've been hearing and talking about for the last month or so, it really often revolves around the warts of democracy, less so the threats. Maybe I'm in the wrong conversation, but the threat to democracy. But just, tyranny of majority is a concern, and when you're not in the majority, and a lot of the arts community is in a fairly minority position sometimes, and there's plenty of other minorities out there who can sort of feel some threat here. But all right, I love the answers, by the way. So I wanted to get to Nicole's question because there's a nice one in the chat. And this is a much more practical one, but probably a much more essential one in some ways. Going, Andrew, to your class, the question is sort of how did you get this sort of community involvement in the beginning? How'd you get people interested and signed up? Was there a cost to participate? And so some of this is like the practical. How would you actually?
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about the practical stuff so we can actually do it.
Yeah.
So I'll talk about the challenges and the benefits of the different ways we've tried. So we created this course as part of the creation of a new urban studies program, and we insisted that this would be a required course and that it would be community-based because that felt essential to the structure of a robust urban planning type program. We initially worked through our community engagement center at the university, which is called the Lindsay Center for Civic Engagement, and they identified existing partners that they already had who had taken other classes in the university that were what we call community-based learning, CBL. Not all of them are side by side, which is the specific format of this class, where students and residents take the class for the whole term together. Some of them are, you go on site and do a visit, whatever. There's all different ways to do CBL. But we wanted to do this. And so we worked with a church, a Baptist church in West Philadelphia that had some members interested. And we went through a vetting process by the pastor. He had to, make sure we'd be okay. They were willing to host it for 10 weeks at night. So having it in a community location, not on campus, was always really important to us. And they, people brought food, and the hospitality from the church was incredible. The challenge of doing it that way is that that's a very limited population, right? So once we had done it with the church, we were like, oh, we'll come back. And they're like, actually, all the members who are interested in this already took the class. So we then tried for a couple of years finding different partners each year and doing it at their locations, which was great, but it created a lot of work for us as instructors to basically produce a 10-week event at another location. So where we shifted is that the community center on campus that sort of sits at the border between campus and West Philadelphia is now the host, and they have classrooms in there, and we use those same networks of connections to recruit people who have been involved in Drexel's community outreach. And the fact now that we've done it for 10 years, friends refer friends who've already taken the class, the word is kind of out, and now we typically get more people applying than we can host. So we have a simple Google form that just says, who are you? What's your connection to community work? Why do you want to take this class? And we just decide basically who has the most relevant experience. They don't pay to take the class, but they also don't get credit. So it's useful to them. They're gaining skills. They're making connections with Drexel students. They're connecting to Drexel as a resource. But one of the things we'd like to do in the future is figure out, is there a way to get community students course credit that if they're thinking about doing a degree, finishing a degree, transferring those credits, can we make that happen? And that we haven't cracked yet, but it's something we're in conversations about.
Well, I'd ask you to maybe take this response or thinking a bit broader, sort of more generalized from that one experience to, I think, others trying to do this kind of practice. It takes extra effort, as you said, from the instructor, but from any of the creative, whoever is leading this often takes a lot more work to do this. And then there's also an infrastructure question sometimes about where this happens or how it happens, and it might be an additional sort of cost to this. Are there thoughts about how to overcome those hurdles in the beginning and what we might do better? Or is it really we just need to focus not so much on those costs, but really start appreciating the benefits and the prize and the reward for doing it and not discount that so much?
Well, from my experience, it does take a lot of work and it is a resource drain. We only teach it once a year, and I have a co-instructor, which I don't normally get to have. And sometimes it's a challenge to find support for the adjunct financially. They just want to say, well, you're teaching the class, you should be the only one. And I have to explain it's such a bigger lift. So what I would say to your point, Doug, is that you don't have to start with the maximalist version of something like this. You can start small and you can iterate and adapt based on the resources you have. What does it look like to take students off campus one time and have them meet with a brown bag meal with residents who have questions or concerns? What does it mean to sort of quote unquote adopt a cultural group for the semester and work on their strategic plan or their marketing plan? I know a lot of us probably already do that kind of community engaged work. So what's the next level of that? There's so many different flavors of this, and you can really build it over time, especially if you're trying to build trust with a community, geographic community, or a community of practice that you haven't worked with before. Don't try to do the maximalist thing first. Make some inroads, and maybe it takes a few years to really get to the place where you want it to go.
Love it. Great. Thanks, Andrew. Tom, if you want to jump in, go ahead. But
I'll just say one thing about this, what we're doing right now, and one of the first events we were invited to in September, right after the book came out, was a webinar, and they wanted to do that kind of webinar where it's just the speakers on the screen and you didn't even know who the other people were in the room. And we said, no, no, no. We have to, so, at least in this format, people have the option to turn on their camera to see their face, turn on their microphone, and to comment. So, I'm hoping we get some folks, and I was hoping Bronwyn would actually turn on her camera and speak, since she's one of the authors in the book.
good. Let's turn it over to Bronwyn. She put a question in the chat also, so I don't need to read it. You can use your own voice, Bronwyn.
Well, hey, thank you. I appreciate that. I just have to say, since anybody on this call who knows me, you know me as Director of Research and Evaluation at the LA County Department of Arts and Culture, and the chapter that I wrote for the book is about my other life. So I imagine I just took off my government employee hat, though it's hard to take off my government employee hat right now because I embrace and proudly claim that I'm a government bureaucrat. All right, in these times. So I just want to say I'm part of a group called Artists for Democracy, and we have been around since 2017 for some of the obvious reasons, and we're really for democracy. But I will say, and we've done a lot around doing get out the vote activities, mostly with college students on college campuses. Oh, thank you, Andrew. I'm also a writer in my free time and a zine maker. And I make zines about how to do democracy. So Artists for Democracy, we're based in LA. Most of the folks are visual artists. I'm the non-visual artist in the group. But we've been doing tons and tons of nonpartisan and also partisan. We're a 501c4, not a C3, to get out the vote activities. And after that, I'm just going to say, after the election in November, we all kind of climbed under our covers and only just recently climbed back out and started having meetings again. And we're starting to organize what it is we're going to do. And actually, we had a great meeting last night. So we're planning events. But one of the big conversations we've been having lately as part of Artists for Democracy, and I'm having this conversation with other people as well, is about that maybe we've been sold a bill of goods on mass movements, and that social media has tried to convince us that if you don't have 1 million followers and you don't have 1 million views, you have no power, that it's not important. And I've been in a lot of conversations about the value of small in-groups and sitting down with people in being co-present and the importance of that right now. And I'd want to kind of bump it back to you, Tom and Andrew, because if we live in such a large country. It's hard to feel like you're making a difference if you don't have, millions of people. We didn't have an equivalent of the 2017 Women's March, or we haven't had it yet. And so I'm looking at the images from, classrooms and community groups. These aren't giant numbers of people, but I think these small groups gathering really, really do matter. And I'd be curious what y'all think about this, and especially in engaging artists.
I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I agree that small groups do matter, and even individual exchanges with other people matter. And that's this part of this idea of everyday democracy, or in practicing in your life every day. And the work we can do in our own communities, in our neighborhood, the block, the building we live in, whatever, it's all important. Um, and even if it's not necessarily going to change the bigger picture in the short term, at least, but change people's lives, and a positive effect on your neighbors and friends and people in your community. I mean, Andrew talked about the Lake Street project. I live on Lake Street in South Minneapolis, which was like 99% boarded up for more than a year after the murder of George Floyd and during the occupation with the National Guard and so on, until after the trial of Derek Chauvin, and then it started to kind of open up again very slowly. And it's still a work in progress years later. Um, but working in that community, being part of it, is just so important, and it's what I can do when I'm there. Um, and one other thing, that I think your being here too is a good example of, and Andrew mentioned that this is a network building uh, project. It's a book, yes, but it's also building dialogue and building networks of people. Um, and I was at a conference here in Bangkok last week, and somebody from Singapore was here, and we started talking. She was like, "Oh, I submitted a chapter to your book and you rejected it." And, so we had a great conversation. But she said the fact that she wrote the abstract and started to do the work, she continued it anyway, and she was published somewhere else, and she was really glad to continue that work. So hopefully, it's a snowballing kind of effect.
I think, Bronwyn, this question of scale plagues us constantly. As an urban planner and, having studied geography, the question of scale is some people think about. And so one of the things that I think has been beneficial about this experience is that we are creating a list of everyone who wants to stay in touch, from Toronto to Minneapolis to Nashville to DC to New York, et cetera. And we don't know exactly what we're going to do with that list, but we know there are people doing similar kinds of work and asking similar kinds of questions all over. So instead of thinking about scale as scaling up, what does it mean to have federations of aligned people and movements in many different places, asking similar kinds of questions? And instead of thinking of things as a national movement or an international movement, what if it's a federation of local movements where, on the daily, you're creating community mutual aid and support with your neighbors and your community members, and then you're also able to use digital technology to connect across space with other people doing the same kinds of things. And that, to me, feels like a way to kind of deal with the scale issue in a productive way. And I've really been doing a lot of reading since our events have started within a term that is probably even more poisonous than democracy today, which is anarchism. But anarchism, not as a sense, of course, of chaos, but as a sense of self-organizing systems, where federations of small communal projects are not isolated from one another, but are organized and operating in the same vector, but with autonomy and voluntary connection. So those are the thoughts that I've been having about that.
Right. Just, looking at the chat, we've got at least 4 questions in there, and we're down to 10 minutes. So we're going to get into the speed round here. No, and I hope we get even more questions. But here's a quick one from Sean. Maybe not a quick one. A quick question, longer answer. how is leaning into this type of work affected by the anti-DEI executive orders, growing efforts, pulled funding, our current maelstrom?
I mean, I like to think it's not affected. I mean, it's just we carry on. We do the work. These are the values that we work with. You know, there of course there's threats to funding to our universities, to nonprofits, arts organizations, and so on. It just makes the work that much more important.
Yeah, and I would say, I was lamenting the fears and challenges that I think we're facing to a friend who's an activist, and he said, well, the civil rights movement wasn't a nonprofit organization. The Black Panthers movement and the Young Lords were not, 501c3s. So you can, as a government, take away funding from these structures, but that doesn't mean you take away the organizing. That doesn't mean to diminish anything that we're facing. And I do think Tom is right that the work has always been urgently important and is continuing to be urgently important, despite and in some remove from the national or international political context. But of course that it has to be informed by it. And Doug, you mentioned this idea of the tyranny of the majority, and I was just looking up a statistic I saw in the New Yorker today. It said Texas is home to 31 million people, but statewide elections are effectively decided by just 1.5 million, which is the average turnout in the Republican primary. So there's not just the tyranny of the majority, but also the way we've gerrymandered our electoral systems, the tyranny of the minority. And so what does it mean when governmental institutions at the local, state, or federal level are making decisions that are absolutely unpopular? Nobody wants them but the people who are sort of have captured the elite capture of the government. So how do we organize in a way that acknowledges that we may have many, many allies in struggles for autonomy and freedom, but they're not necessarily in seats of power?
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's awesome. And I think it gets to some of the sort of small end scaling things as well, and networking, right? Part of what makes that minority so powerful is the network and that connection. And I think this sort of small end versus mass movement bit comes out in a question from Jenna that I want to ask. First of all, I want to echo her big thank you to you guys for this great presentation. So Tom, you mentioned when talking about the book events and this idea that we're not going to do things where it's just faces on the screen of the speakers and everyone else is anonymous and invisible and all, and it matters what kind of space it is and who's in the room. So the question here is about these sort of book events is, can you talk more about who is actually in the room and who isn't in the room when you do these, and how do you manage any presumptions of participation and assumptions of brave spaces, this kind of stuff?
Most of the book events have been sponsored by colleges and universities. So the people in the room, whether it's virtual or real, tend to be, faculty, students, intellectuals of various kinds. One of the things when Andrew and I went to Toronto in January, there were two. The University of Toronto brought us in, but they had a fledgling relationship with Ontario College of Art and Design, and that event that they coordinated became an opportunity for those two institutions to start working together, and they really kind of built a dialogue and built some relationships, and are continuing to go along that path. Andrew's going back there in April for an event where they're bringing more of the public and other folks into the conversation. Of course, the Canadians are far more ahead of this conversation than maybe we are in the United States, but anyway, that's the late night is getting
It's getting
too much.
later. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I'll
go
just
ahead,
say
Andrew.
also, Tom, that we have been really emphasizing embodied practice and movement and engagement, but we've really tried to be careful and acknowledge that not everyone moves in the same way, not everyone is present in their bodies or in space in the same way. And when we did our event in Philly a couple weeks ago, the choreographer who was leading us, said, I think I'll just do it as a seated exercise, the first part as a seated exercise. And she really named that this is an invitation to participate in any way that feels right to you, including not participating. Refusal is also an act of participation. And so really framing the space as an invitation and not a requirement, especially in spaces like, CUNY's public policy school, or, the planning program and architecture program at University of Maryland. These are not people who come expecting to do a creative act. So we have to scaffold that for them and make sure that that's something they feel invited to do. And I think maybe that could answer go towards an answer towards Carol's question about how do you deal with the difference between required content and creative expression in things like arts management. And so in addition to teaching in my urban studies role, I also teach in arts administration at Drexel. And one way we've engaged people and communities in our work in the classroom is, like I said before, working with an organization across a term to help them do a part of their mission that they can't get to, that our students need to learn about: marketing plans, websites, etc. But we've also now created a required course based on the side-by-side community course that I was talking about previously, where the community that will be side-by-side with the Drexel students is not a geographic community, but it's artists and cultural workers. And it's a course on kind of creative placemaking and community planning with a cultural lens. And the idea is to really have everyone brainstorming about how to move the needle in their community-based work as from an arts perspective. And so this is required content for these students. There will be writing assignments, there will be presentations and group projects, there will be learning outcomes. And I think the way I was trained to construct a course in a syllabus, because I got absolutely no training in my PhD program on how to teach, was make a list of all the things you've read that you've liked and break it out by week and send that to the students and have them write a couple papers. And oh my God, how, thankfully I've had a lot of good mentorship along the way. But if we start by creating our courses and our programs from the learning outcomes we want students to have, including like moral inquiry and other kinds of competencies that are like these soft skills, and design our courses and our requirements in service of the learning goals, then I think we can make space within our curricula for a little more experimentation, while not losing sight of rigor.
That's great. So good. We got Carol's question automatically or flowed right in and covered it. Tom, if you've got other things you want to add into about sort of insights and practices that you have picked up about how to deliver sort of the nuts and bolts, the required content that you're told you have to cover in your professional degree program, feel free to add a little bit more.
My brain is a little foggy right now, but the one thing I will say is I try to have, for every class, the students rearrange the furniture in the room. Sort of co-creating the learning environment, like always looking for ways to co-create the learning environment, whether it's a physical space or presenting an agenda that for the evening's course, and which one do you want to do first? So just like these tiny little practices I try to bring in.
Well, maybe I'll try to wrap this up a little bit by saying I think these tiny little practices scale also, not just doing big practices, but many, many tiny practices add up. And I love Andrew's bits on sort of federated systems and all of this, but in some ways it's a metaphor about co-creating, and maybe some of the stresses that have been mentioned in the conversation now about sort of democracy and the arts are this feeling that we're not co-creating right now in terms of in the policy space. It's much more top-down dictating things rather than co-creating. And that maybe is a testament to the value and benefits to co-creating, and that we really might get some different outcomes. So that's my positive spin and endorsement for all of what you guys have put together with what looks to be a great book. So with that, let's bring it to a close at 1 o'clock or midnight in Bangkok. Thank you all. Thanks to the speakers for this, and then thanks to everybody else for coming in and joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another version of this workshop. So thank you all. Thanks, Tom and Andrew.
Great.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to put a couple links in the chat, one to the book and one to another participatory project that I've been working on with Julie Goodman on humanities practice. So more to come. Please reach out to us if you have any further questions. And thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. We'll keep this up for another few seconds to give people a chance to grab those links out of the chat before they log off. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.
Take care.
Thanks,
Doug.
everyone. That was great. Thanks, Doug.
Of course. Look forward to seeing you.
Thanks, Becca. Great seeing you. Take care.